She was 29 years old when the town of Meridian Crossing decided, by a vote taken in the back room of its own church, that she no longer belonged among them. Her name was cleared by no one, her grief acknowledged by no one, and when the last of her belongings had been loaded onto a borrowed cart, she found herself standing at the edge of the settlement with $12 sewn into the hem of a traveling skate and nowhere in the world that wanted her. It was in that condition, friendless and nearly penniless, that she rode 2 days north into the Wyoming high country and came upon the abandoned remains of Fort Wren, a cavalry outpost decommissioned and left to the wind more than a decade before, its gates hanging open, its barracks sagging, its flagpole bare. She paid $1 for the whole ruined property to a land office clerk who could not fathom why anyone would want it. It seemed, to everyone who heard of it, the final proof that she had lost not only her home but her good sense along with it. But sealed within the walls of that forgotten fort was a secret buried since the war itself, one that would not only restore the life that had been stolen from her, but would return to an entire region a truth that had spent a generation trying to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calloway. If you have ever been made to feel unwelcome in a place you once called home, tell us where you're watching from tonight in the comments. We read everyone, and we are glad this story has found you. Josephine Calloway was born in the autumn of 1847 in a small settlement called Meridian Crossing, tucked into the rolling grassland of the Wyoming Territory where two well-traveled wagon roads met beside a shallow, reliable ford, a geographic accident that had given the town its purpose and, for a time, its modest prosperity. Her father, Reuben Calloway, had come west as a young surveyor in the years before her birth, mapping land for the railroad companies that were only beginning to dream their way across the continent, and he had settled in Meridian Crossing because, he told his daughter more than once in her childhood, it was the first place in his long years of wandering that had felt less like a stopping point and more like an arrival. He built a modest house at the edge of town and took up work as a settlement surveyor and, eventually, its informal keeper of records, a man whose careful hand-drawn maps and boundary notations became, over the years, the closest thing Meridian Crossing had to an official memory of itself. Her mother, Winifred Calloway, had trained as a nurse before her marriage in one of the few formal nursing programs available to women of her generation, and she brought to the household a particular calm competence in matters of illness and injury that made her, within a few years of her arrival in the territory, the closest thing surrounding ranches and homesteads had to a doctor. She delivered babies. She set broken bones. She sat through fever nights with strangers' children when no one else in the region had the knowledge or the steadiness to do so, and she taught her daughter, from the time Josephine was old enough to hold a roll bandage correctly, that the duty to tend to a suffering stranger was not a favor extended but an obligation owed, plain and unadorned, to anyone who found themselves in need. We do not nurse people because we like them, Winifred used to say, washing her hands in the enamel basin after the long night's work. We nurse them because they are hurting, and that is reason enough. Josephine grew up, then, in a household organized around two disciplines that would prove, in the end, to be the very tools that saved her father's precise, patient cartography, his insistence that every boundary and structure and feature of the land deserved to be recorded honestly and without alteration, and her mother's fierce, unsentimental commitment to caring for whoever needed care, regardless of what that person had done to deserve or not deserve it. She was not, by the town's estimation, a particularly remarkable young woman in her girlhood quiet, watchful, more comfortable with the book of her father's survey notes than with the social gatherings that occupied the other daughters of Meridian Crossing. But she possessed a steadiness that people noticed even when they did not remark upon it, the same quality her father had noticed in the land itself when he first came west. Something reliable beneath the surface, waiting to be properly understood. The war came to the territory not as battles fought on its own soil, for Wyoming saw little of the direct combat that scarred the eastern states, but as a slow, grinding presence nonetheless, soldiers passing through on their way to postings further west, wounded men returning home change, and Fort Wren itself, established in 1862 some 15 miles north of Meridian Crossing, garrisoned throughout the war years with cavalry units tasked, officially, with protecting the wagon roads and, unofficially, with a great many duties the official record never fully explained. Josephine's mother had traveled to Fort Wren on more than one occasion during those years, some when the post's own surgeon fell ill or was overwhelmed, and Josephine, by then a girl of 16 or 17, had sometimes accompanied her, learning the layout of the fort's infirmary and, more quietly, absorbing something of its atmosphere, the particular tension of a military post that seemed, even to a girl's eyes, to be holding more than the ordinary business of defending a wagon road. It was at 19, in the final year of the war, that Josephine met and married Daniel Whitcomb, a young lieutenant stationed at Fort Wren whose gentle manner and evident intelligence had drawn her attention across the fort's small chapel during one of her mother's visits. Their courtship was brief, as wartime courtships often were, but it was genuine, and Josephine found in Daniel a partner who valued her father's precision and her mother's compassion in equal measure, who spoke to her not as a woman to be managed, but as an equal to be consulted, a rarity in that time and place that she had not expected to find and treasured accordingly. They married in the autumn of 1864, and Daniel, though his cavalry duties kept him often at the fort, built with Josephine a small house on the edge of Meridian Crossing where they intended, once his service concluded, to raise a family they had already begun quietly planning between themselves. The fall came swiftly and from a direction Josephine had never anticipated. Daniel was killed in the spring of 1865, in the war's final weeks, not in any battle that made its way into the histories, but in circumstances that the Army's official notification described only vaguely as an incident during a supply escort, a phrasing that gave Josephine no comfort and, as she would only understand many years later, deliberately concealed far more than it revealed. She grieved him with the same quiet steadiness her mother had modeled for her throughout her girlhood, returning to her parents' household and, in time, to the work of nursing herself, having absorbed enough of a mother's training over the years to make herself useful in the same capacity Winifred had once served the region. It was in this period, in the years immediately following the war, that a darker shape began to settle over Josephine's life, one she did not fully understand until it was far too late to prevent its consequences. A man named Harlan Bexley, who had served as Fort Wren's quartermaster during the war years and had, in its aftermath, become one of Meridian Crossing's most prominent citizens through investments in land and cattle that seemed, to those who bothered to wonder about it, disproportionate to any salary a quartermaster might reasonably have earned, took a particular and unwelcome interest in Josephine following her widowhood. His attentions, pressed upon her with an insistence that grew less patient with each refusal, were rebuffed as gently and then as firmly as she knew how to manage, and Bexley, a man unaccustomed to refusal in a town where his wealth had purchased him considerable influence, did not take the rejection well. The turn against her began slowly, in the manner such things often do, a whispered suggestion here, a pointed absence of invitation there, small social slights that Josephine, absorbed in her grief and her nursing work, was slow to recognize as anything more than the ordinary friction of small-town life. But the whispers hardened, over the following 2 years, into something more deliberate and more damaging, rumors, traceable in later years to sources close to Bexley, though never definitively to the man himself, that Josephine had somehow been complicit in or had improper knowledge of the true circumstances of her husband's death. Insinuations dark enough and vague enough that they could not be directly refuted, but persistent enough that they steadily eroded the goodwill her family had built. Over 2 decades in Meridian Crossing, her father's death in 1868, from a heart weakened by years of hard travel across difficult country, removed the household's other anchor of respectability, and her mother, aging and increasingly reliant on Josephine's care rather than able to provide her own protective standing in the community, could do little to stem the tide. The final blow came in the spring of 1876, when a fire destroyed the town's feed store, a fire whose cause was never conclusively established, but which certain voices in Meridian Crossing, voices that Josephine would later have reason to believe were guided by Bexley's own quiet influence, chose to associate, through insinuation rather than evidence, with a nursing patient of Josephine's who had died unexpectedly that same week. A death entirely explicable by the man's advanced illness, but rendered suspicious in the retelling by parties who found it convenient to have Josephine's reputation further tarnished. A town meeting was called, ostensibly to discuss the feed store's rebuilding, but which turned, under the steady guidance of men whose loyalties to Bexley ran deeper than their loyalty to fairness, into an informal referendum on whether Josephine Calloway Whitcomb still belonged among them. No formal charge was ever made against her, for there was no evidence to support one, but the vote, taken in the back room of the town's small church with solemnity that Josephine found almost more painful than open hostility would have been, concluded that her presence was, in the delicate phrasing the town elders settled upon, no longer conducive to the community's peace. She left Meridian Crossing 3 weeks later, her mother having died the previous winter and leaving her, at least, unburdened of the fear of what will become of an aging parent left behind. She had $12 sewn carefully into the hem of a traveling skirt, as a mother had once taught her to secure money against thieves in desperate circumstances alike, a small trunk of belongings, and a horse that had been her father's, aging now but still sound. She rode north, away from the only home she had ever known, with no particular destination in mind beyond simply putting distance between herself and a town that had decided, without evidence and without mercy, that she was better gone. It was on the second day of this aimless northward journey that she came upon Fort Wren itself, decommissioned since 1867, when the Army, its wartime purposes served and the frontier's military priorities shifting westward, had abandoned the post entirely, leaving its buildings to the slow erosion of weather and neglect. Josephine had not intended to travel this particular road, but something in her, perhaps the simple pull of familiar ground in a season when everything else familiar had been stripped from her, guided her horse toward the fort's silent gates, and she found herself sitting astride her father's old horse, looking upon the place where she had once accompanied her mother on nursing visits, where she had met and married Daniel, where the last happy chapter of her young life had unfolded before her. War and Harlan Bexley's malice had taken it all away. The fort stood open and forsaken, its perimeter fence broken in long stretches, its parade ground overtaken by prairie grass grown waist-high, its barracks building sagging under years of unrepaired weather damage, and yet something in its silence struck Josephine not as desolation but as a kind of patient waiting, the same quality she had once noticed in her father's careful, unhurried survey work, the sense of a thing holding its story quietly until someone arrived willing to listen for it. She rode into the fort's central grounds and dismounted beside the old headquarters building, and standing there in the tall grass with the wind moving through empty window frames, she found herself making a decision that she could not, in that moment, have fully explained even to herself, beyond a simple, stubborn refusal to arrive at whatever came next in her life with absolutely nothing that had once been Hayes. She rode the following morning to the Territorial Land Office in the nearest county seat, a modest brick building she reached after a half-day's travel, and inquired what would be required to purchase the decommissioned fort and its surrounding acreage, land that had reverted, upon the Army's departure, to territorial ownership and had sat unclaimed ever since. Considered too remote and too encumbered by deteriorating structures to attract serious interest from the ranchers and homesteaders, who might otherwise have coveted the acreage. The clerk, a thin, spectacled man named Aldous Pruitt, who processed land claims with the weary efficiency of a man who had seen every manner of frontier ambition pass across his desk, informed her that the territory would be glad to be rid of the liability, that the buildings themselves held no value beyond salvage, and that $1, the minimum fee his own regulations permitted him to accept, would settle the matter entirely. Josephine paid the $1 from a carefully guarded 12 and rode away from that land office holding a deed to a ruined fort that, she understood even as she accepted the paper, represented either the most foolish decision of a difficult year or something else entirely, something she would not understand the shape of for weeks yet to come. She took up residence in the fort's old headquarters building, the sturdiest of its remaining structures, patching its roof as best she could with materials salvaged from the more thoroughly collapsed barracks, and she spent her first weeks there in the particular labor of making a ruin livable, clearing debris, repairing what could be repaired, and, in the process, developing an intimate familiarity with the fort's layout that exceeded even what she had absorbed as a girl accompanying her mother's nursing visits. It was in the third week of this labor, while clearing the old infirmary building where her mother had once treated fevered soldiers and where Josephine herself had spent hours as a girl learning to roll bandages properly, that she noticed something that struck her as odd enough to warrant closer investigation. A section of the infirmary's back wall, constructed of the same rough-hewn timber as the rest of the structure, that nonetheless sounded subtly different when struck than the walls. Surrounding it, a slightly hollow resonance that her father's old surveying instincts, absorbed into her own habits of careful observation over a childhood spent at his side, told her was worth pursuing rather than dismissing. It took her the better part of 2 days, working with a pry bar salvage from the fort's old blacksmith shop, to work loose enough of the timber facing to reveal what lay behind it. A shallow storage cavity, built into the wall construction with evident deliberate purpose rather than accident, containing a metal dispatch box of the sort Army units use to secure official documents during transport. Its lock long since rusted, but it seemed still holding tight against the years of weather that had, remarkably, never fully penetrated the infirmary's back wall. Josephine worked the rusted lock free with the same pry bar, and lifting the lid in the dim afternoon light filtering through the infirmary's broken windows, she found herself looking at a stack of official military correspondence, orders, and personal letters, their paper yellow but their ink still largely legible, bound together with a leather cord that had cracked with age but held its knot regardless. She carried the box to a patch of clear light near the infirmary's doorway and began, with the same patient attention her father had brought to every survey line he ever drew, to work through its contents. And what she found, over the following days of careful reading, reshaped entirely her understanding of the fort where she had once been briefly, unknowingly happy. The documents detailed, in the careful bureaucratic language of wartime military correspondence, an operation that Fort Wren Command had conducted throughout the later years of the war, one never formally acknowledged in any official history of the post. A systematic diversion of supplies intended for frontier garrisons further west, funneled instead through a network of civilian contractors for private profit, an operation whose principal civilian coordinator, named repeatedly throughout the correspondence in terms that left no ambiguity about his role, was Fort Wren's own quartermaster Harlan Bexley. The letters made clear that this diversion had not been a minor or victimless matter. Supplies meant for garrisons defending isolated settlements further along the frontier had been systematically shorted, their content sold instead through Bexley's civilian contacts at considerable profit. A scheme that had, according to one particularly detailed letter from a junior officer expressing his private misgivings to a trusted colleague, directly contributed to shortages that left at least one western outpost dangerously undersupplied during a difficult winter, a circumstance the letters author connected, with evident guilt, to hardship and possibly death among both the soldiers stationed there and the civilian settlers who depended on that garrison protection and provisions. And woven through the correspondence, in a discovery that stopped Josephine's breath entirely when she finally reached it, was a final report dated just days before Daniel's death, in which her husband, who had evidently begun his own quiet investigation into irregularities he had noticed in the fort supply records, was named as having gathered evidence sufficient to bring formal charges against Bexley, evidence he had intended to submit to the fort's commanding officer within the week. Daniel Whitcomb had died. Josephine now understood with a clarity that left her sitting motionless in the infirmary's dim light for the better part of an hour, not in any ordinary mishap of a supply escort, but in circumstances that the vague official notification had been carefully worded to obscure, circumstances that the documents in her hands strongly suggested had been arranged, whether directly or through Bexley's considerable influence over the men beneath him, to prevent her husband from ever delivering the evidence he had gathered. The dispatch box itself, she came to understand from a final, hastily written note tucked among the papers and signed with initials she did not immediately recognize, had been hidden by a sympathetic clerk in the fort's final weeks of operation, a man who had evidently feared for his own safety should Bexley's influence extend to silencing him as well, and who had chosen concealment within the fort's own walls over the risk of exposure, trusting that someday someone would find what he had not dared to deliver himself. Josephine sat with this knowledge for several days before she could bring herself to act upon it. Grief for Daniel arriving fresh and raw in a way it had not since the earliest weeks of her widowhood, compounded now by the staggering realization that the man who had orchestrated her husband's death was the very man whose malice, pursued in the years since through whispered rumor and social exclusion, had ultimately driven her from Meridian Crossing entirely. But grief, in Josephine, had never looked like paralysis, and within the week she found herself doing what her father would have done with any discovery of genuine importance, verifying it, methodically and without haste, cross-referencing names and dates in the dispatch box against what fragment of official fort records she could locate among the abandoned headquarters building's remaining files, building a case as carefully constructed as any survey line her father had ever drawn. Word that Josephine Calloway Whitcomb had taken up residence at the old Fort reached Meridian Crossing within weeks, carried by travelers along the wagon road who had noticed smoke from her chimney and lamplight in the old headquarters building, and the news reached Harlan Bexley himself not long after, delivered, Josephine would later learn, by one of the very men who had helped orchestrate her expulsion from town 2 years before. Bexley's response was not immediate, for he was, whatever his moral failings, a careful man who understood the danger of acting rashly, but within a month he had arranged, through intermediaries whose names never appeared directly in the exchange, to have a formal notice delivered to Josephine challenging the validity of her land purchase, arguing through territorial lawyers that decommissioned military property required more elaborate transfer process than the simple land office sale alders. Pruitt had conducted, and that her occupation of the fort constituted, in the careful legal language his representatives employed, an unauthorized encroachment upon federal land. Josephine understood immediately what this legal maneuvering truly represented. Not a genuine concern for proper land transfer procedure, but Bexley's recognition that her presence at the fort, and whatever she might have found there, posed a danger he intended to eliminate before it could take shape as a formal accusation. She traveled to the county seat, and rather than simply defending her land claim through Aldous Pruitt's original transaction, which he suspected correctly would not withstand serious legal challenge from a man of Bexley's resources, she instead sought out the territory's federal marshal, a steady, unhurried man named Wendell Coates, who maintained an office in the same county seat and she had learned through careful inquiry, no particular loyalty to Bexley's interests, having only recently been appointed to the position from outside the territory entirely. She laid the dispatch box's contents before Marshal Coates with the same methodical patience her father had brought to every survey he ever conducted, walking him through the correspondence documenting the supply diversion scheme, the connection to the undersupplied Western garrison, and, most critically, the final report naming her husband's intended charges against Bexley just days before his death. Coates, examining the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance immediately, informed her that the matter exceeded his own jurisdiction, but that he possessed the authority and, evidently, the inclination to refer it directly to federal military investigators still active in that period reviewing irregularities from the war years, an investigative apparatus that had, in the decades since the war's end, grown considerably more thorough and less inclined toward the kind of quiet accommodation that had allowed men like Bexley to escape scrutiny in the war's immediate aftermath. Bexley, learning of this referral through channels Josephine never fully traced, attempted one final maneuver, arriving at the fort himself one autumn afternoon with 2 hired men in tow, ostensibly to formally notify Josephine of the land dispute, but with an evident intention, communicated through tone and posture more than through anything he directly said, to intimidate her into abandoning both the fort and whatever claims he might be preparing to make. Josephine met him at the fort's broken gate alone, her father's old horse saddled nearby should she need it, and informed him, with a steadiness that she drew directly from a mother's example of facing down every crisis without visible fear, that federal investigators already possessed copies of the documents she had found. Copies she had taken the precaution of preparing, and sending ahead through Marshal Coates' own office specifically to remove any advantage Bexley might gain through further intimidation or, worse, through destruction of the evidence itself. Bexley left the fort that afternoon without further threat. Understanding, Josephine suspected that whatever influence had once protected him in Meridian Crossing held no purchase whatsoever against a federal investigation now bearing down upon him. The investigation that followed occupied the better part of a year, drawing investigators to Meridian Crossing and to the fort itself, interviewing surviving veterans of Fort Wren's wartime garrison and cross-referencing the dispatch box's documents against surviving federal supply records, a process that confirmed, in exhaustive and damning detail, the full scope of Bexley's wartime diversion scheme and its connection to genuine hardship suffered by soldiers and settlers alike at the undersupplied Western garrison. Bexley was formally charged with wartime fraud and, in connection with mounting circumstantial evidence regarding the specific circumstances of Daniel Whitcomb's death that the investigators pursued with considerable diligence once the broader scheme came to light, face additional scrutiny that, whatever its ultimate legal resolution, permanently and publicly stripped him of the respectability his stolen wealth had purchased him in Meridian Crossing. His land holdings, financed substantially through the profits of his wartime scheme, was seized in restitution proceedings that stretched across several years, and the man who had once commanded such quiet, unchallenged influence over the town's affairs found himself, by the investigation's conclusion, without wealth, without standing, and without a single voice in Meridian Crossing willing to speak in his defense. The very silence that had once protected him now abandoning him entirely. Josephine did not use the restitution funds awarded to her as Daniel's widow, once the investigation formally acknowledged his death's true circumstances, merely to rebuild a private life for herself, though after everything she had endured, no one in the territory would have questioned that choice. Instead, understanding with her mother's old conviction that obligation to the suffering did not end simply because her own suffering had been acknowledged. She used a substantial portion of the funds to restore Fort Wren's old infirmary building fully, establishing it as a proper medical outpost serving the scattered ranches and homesteads of the surrounding country, a region that had, in the years since the fort's decommissioning, gone without any reliable medical care whatsoever. She trained, in time, a small staff of nurses drawing on her mother's methods, and the old fort, once a symbol of wartime corruption and personal loss, became instead a place where the region's settlers could bring their fevers and their broken bones and their difficult births, a quiet, steady institution that honored, in equal measure, her father's insistence on careful truth-telling and her mother's fierce commitment to unconditional care. And so we return to where this story began, to a woman of 29 riding away from the only town she had ever called home, $12 sewn into a skirt and nothing ahead of her but uncertain road. Josephine Calloway could not have known, paying her single dollar to a puzzled land clerk for a ruin that everyone else considered worthless, that the smallness of that purchase was about to become the instrument not merely of her own vindication, but of a truth an entire region had never known it was owed. She did not find what she found because fortune favored her. She found it because her father had taught her that every structure holds its story for those patient enough to listen for the hollow place in the wall, and because her mother had taught her that the obligation to tend to suffering, once recognized, does not end simply because the suffering has finally been acknowledged. What looked to Meridian Crossing like the final, foolish act of a woman with nothing left to lose was, in truth, the beginning of the only justice her husband would ever receive, and the beginning of the only mercy an overlooked country would ever be offered. Thank you for staying with us through Josephine's story tonight. If it moved you even a little, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need a reminder that the truth, however long buried, does not lose its power to set things right. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your life when you found real value or real truth in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and they stay with us long after we've read them. Until next time, stay close.